Welcome everyone to this week's collective learning meeting. Please remember to mute your microphones unless you want to ask a question. Feel free to ask questions at any time and use the chat box. If you type a question there, I, Christine Tang, can ask the question for you. Our presenter today is Urmila Mallick, who graduated from WPI in 2021 with a bachelor's in biology and biotechnology and a bachelor's in environmental and sustainability studies and a minor in social entrepreneurship. Urmila was awarded an NSF Graduate Research Fellowship in 2021 and joined Yale University's Master's in Environmental Science program at the School of Environment this fall. Please take us away, Urmila.
Thank you, Christine. Give me 1 second. I'll share slides in just a moment. Okay. Hopefully you can see that.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you everyone so much for being here. My name is Urmila, and during my junior year and senior years at WPI, I started working on a project with Dr. Saeed. He advised me for my majors in, for my MQP and IQP work for my double major. And the project started off as an IQP project, but then it kind of progressed along with my MQP and ultimately became sort of a paper. So we were excited. We published it a few months ago, but there is still a lot of things that are still great questions for us within this the model that we came up with, and I'm interested to know how it can be better put to actual realistic use. So I have questions based on those things that I'm still exploring. My project focused on researching social integration feasibility for free-ranging dogs. I'm going to call them FRD from now on, for animal welfare, public health, and conservation benefits. Just for reference, there's about 750 million to 1 billion of these FRD in the world today. To just give everyone a little bit of background on the project, because I'm coming from a biology background, my impetus for the project was more from the welfare conservation aspect. However, FRDs represent about 75% of the global dog population. India particularly has a really high density of FRDs, between 30 to 60 million. But the landrace that is originally known to the Indian landscape, which is called the pariah dog landrace, it's immensely intelligent and highly adaptable to local environments. However, it faces pretty harsh welfare conditions, as you can see in the images, and a lot of human-induced threats. And no comprehensive population intervention has really been carried out in India yet. There have been many small-scale sterilization and culling campaigns, but they often end up pretty unhygienic or unsuccessful due to things like corruption. So as a result, India reports about 1/3 of annual global deaths from canine rabies. FRD are also currently being studied more and more as a conservation threat in India, since they transmit zoonotic diseases and even cause species extinctions and disturb migration patterns when attacking livestock, wildlife, and endangered species. And they're also allowed to enter protected areas. So it's a very multifaceted problem. And based on my understanding of the literature and what is happening on the ground, it is pretty understandable that it's effectively impossible for India to maintain or reduce this really high population of dogs, since you would need to sterilize a very high percentage for many years, which is difficult given the population size and the infrastructure available in India. So I started my study of this, of this system by looking at Dr. Saeed's paper and model on the stray dog issue in Bangkok. So back in 2009, he had this model which is a model showing the very classic like population dynamics of a dog species, and it's showing a very classic like birth and death rate. But the interesting thing in this model is that it shows that the very conventional methods of like removing dogs from a system by sterilization or just removal doesn't really fix the problem, because this like latent capacity support system, which is essentially ecological niches, they kind of open up and allow other dogs to come in and do better, and therefore there are more dogs. So this has now been kind of proven that this is kind of what happens in India in a lot of systems. And so Dr. Saeed's kind of, like proposed policy through this was that waste management needs to be improved so that birth rate is reduced and death rate is increased among dogs. However, in the Indian context, I found that this is a little bit, although this is a really interesting idea, it's very difficult to implement in India. There's a very large population of dogs. They very, very heavily depend on food waste, mostly scavenging, and it results in a pretty big welfare threat. Indian people are also in very interesting ways linked to the dogs in their communities, so it'd be very hard to just suddenly cut them off from any food source. So it's not very realistic in this sense. So we tried to design, we set up a model showing the very conventional policies that exist mostly across the world, and propose a slightly new policy, which we're going to call social integration. And so this is the model that we were working on. So this is just like the top level. So I'm trying to get my mouse. Yeah, so this is just the top level causal loop diagram. I'll get to this interface later. But this shows initially at the top, it has the previously proposed policies, which include waste management in this carrying capacity module, as well as sterilization, euthanasia, and sheltering. So those are the 4 methods that are usually used in this case in any country. And in comparison, we have this other policy right here, and on top of everything, we have a funding module, and what is being affected is the FRD population dynamics. So what we're trying to really talk about here is kind of talk about the idea of social integration. So animal-assisted interventions have been proven to have a lot of positive effects in many different scenarios, and that was kind of my MQP work to kind of find the understanding of, how effective could this be. But we have found that you can treat a lot of things like social behavior, blood pressure, PTSD, a lot of various different types of serious conditions with animal-assisted interventions, and therefore FRD would be a very interesting. It would be very interesting to bring them into the Indian system. Also, for reference, in case people don't know this that much, in India, dogs are not really adopted that much off the streets. It's mostly outside dogs are imported in. So people usually get pets from the outside, even in the context of in the army, in the police, canine dogs are usually German shepherds and dogs that are not accustomed to the very harsh, different landscape of India. So implementing this sort of a system would essentially reduce, ideally, the spread of rabies in India, the attacks on wildlife, and human deaths, while improving human awareness of the dogs that are around them and psychiatric health. So the gaming environment on the right is shown because so users can use it to come up with a very optimal intervention and strategy based on identifying those parameters that are shown there. And I'll come back to that later. So the questions right now that I'm still interested in after working through the model is, the first thing is, how can time lags be improved, especially in the case that when an intervention is applied in the model, it needs to pass through multiple modules, and the effects need to be sort of felt immediately, just because that sort of is what's happening on the ground. But in the model, it's passing through various modules and it's coming up a little late. And specifically, something like an example would be, to activate this module, I need to go into funding. I activate it to provide funding for social integration. It passes into FRD Dynamics to kind of take FRD and kind of apply it into this module. And then based on this, there's a certain income that is generated and it passes back to funding. So this oh, I'm sorry, my mouse has not been there. So this sort of like transfer from here to here is causing a delay in the slight delay in the system. And we've tried to troubleshoot that, but it's been a little bit challenging. Second thing is, how can I also include parameters on like non-numerical variables, such as like human awareness, things that are very important for the population management on the ground. There's a sort of negative attitude towards dogs overall. So that if that changes, there's potential that this whole model would be improved in different ways. And finally, how can I improve, change, or add to the parameters in the model to make them more realistic for users? So I'm going to just talk through the modules just to give an idea of what is happening. So on the left here, the first module, it shows the FRD dynamics, which include the population dynamics and avenues for policy implementation. As long as the policies are correctly activated, this module will show like the corresponding effects on the population structure. So for example, this is a sterilization that is, it's a very clear like flow moving into a stock, and then euthanasia is increasing the like death rate, and different things are affecting like birth rate, death rate, as well as taking them out of the system altogether. The second module here on the, sorry, my mouse is not working. Okay, sorry. The second module here on the right is taken almost exactly from Professor Saeed's model on the study of the Bangkok stray dog problem. So it's, since we've established that there's a support system here that's, you know, affecting the population structure, we can apply it here as well to understand that waste management would help. So we're noting that, but we're not really applying it in this model that much. The three modules shown here depict the common sterilization, euthanasia, and sheltering policies. And in all of them, funds are calculated based on the available budget for the policy. And sterilization, for example, creates a new stock of sterilized FRD. Euthanasia increases the death rate, as I said, and shelters actually generate an income for further adoption through that system. The proposed social integration module, which is on the top left, is kind of like a series of flows that allows FRD to be streaming through these training processes and income to be generated at down here. So there's these different ways. It can be much more complex, but to be honest, we have tried to keep it simpler, average a lot of these processes to keep it a little bit tight. So that's what that first module is showing. The second one on the bottom is showing how the budget can be oriented towards, you know, allocating towards these different policies. So like here we have like sources of income, and if there's also like a normal steady budget, as well as like a budget constraint on the right side. So we make sure that only the money that is available is being used in the system. So in the first set of simulations, we see that there's like a goal-seeking behavior in the FRD population if inadequate yearly sterilization funding is applied. So this is like red in all cases is the FRD population. So this is what is seen. It was seen in Bangkok. It was seen in many cases in India. And there's a lot of money that is put in, and finally there's no effect. So even if we put in a significantly higher amount of money, it only affects it after a very long time due to the very high survival effect in that carrying capacity module. For the shelter policy, it's almost the same, although there is some income. Now, this is based on what I found from what is really happening in India, what people are willing to pay on the ground to, you know, take an animal in. It's not very realistic, so it doesn't really provide a solution. And to be clear, right now in India, this is exactly what's happening. There is only very little sterilization, and people think that shelters will solve the problem, but it's not really going anywhere. So this is the idea that social integration would cause kind of a series of effects. And I know there's a lot of lines here, but I will just highlight what's important. Sorry, what's happening here? I don't know what's happening, but some words are not showing up on my screen, but I'll explain. So on the left, we see that the population is kind of steady for a very long time, and then it has a sharp drop. So what's happening in the beginning and in this purple line is essentially increasing social integration year by year to a certain extent until there's enough budget within the system to do a very short and very effective sterilization campaign. There's been a lot of studies to show that sterilization can't be maintained for a long period because it just is not feasible for a lot of countries to do nationwide campaigns for decades, of course. So doing this sort of a social integration effect creates a very high budget. It also creates a very wide diversity of dogs that are put into use. There's a change in human awareness, behavior. And then, of course, you don't need such a long time to reduce that population. And this is just a comparison to show you can do that. You could, if you do even more social integration, put in more money into the system, it can be solved in a much better way as well. So there are various ways that the system can be handled and combined in terms of policies, but I can speak to that again later. But in conclusion, what we found is that investigating these kind of more innovative streams that FRD can train through can effectively replace the undesirable effects that they're having right now with benefits for a lot of different stakeholders. Right now, the only benefit is the only system is put in money and hope that there will be less dogs, but there's truly no benefit beyond that and nothing else really coming out of it. But this system would allow a lot of very interesting things to come up. Yeah, so a few years of very concerted social integration can help fund a more focused sterilization effort. The gaming environment should essentially allow any policymaker in any country with an FRD problem to input their local, location-specific parameters and simulate the costs and benefits of also training and deploying these FRD. Things that I studied more through my MQP was, how feasible is it? There's also an obvious, the more number of years this is put into place, the more efficient, more effective the process would become. So the model would kind of improve itself over time, ideally. But since most population interventions in India have fallen flat due to these unintended consequences or lack of funding, simulating this could really help plan something for the future. So yeah, I have these questions again listed here that have been my primary questions at this point. But I would love anyone's feedback on anything in this project. It's very multifaceted and it covers different disciplines. So it has a lot of questions that still remain. Also, just for reference, in case anyone's interested, this picture refers to one of the first very local, this is a local street dog in Calcutta in India that was studied very extensively and put into the police system in India. And it has been shown to be much more effective than any imported breed dog from the United States or anywhere else. And it outperforms every other dog. So there's been some very interesting studies of that. But anyway, thank you for listening. And please, I'd love to have any questions or to discuss anything that might be of interest to anyone.
Urmila, can I start out with questions?
Sure, absolutely.
And did I say your name right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. So I noticed on slide 8, can you go back to that one? You have some diagrams here, and I see on the left, especially a lot of these, well, actually all over, their flows are shown with a double-sided arrow as a biflow. Is that on purpose?
It's a biflow. To be honest, this is something that Professor Saeed has been very specific with me on allowing, in case the system is running incorrectly and there's dogs going the wrong way or something, units not clear, that we can see that change, but they should be flowing in one direction. That's the idea. Okay, so
the arrows are there to say that it's possible in your model evaluation to check to make sure that they're not going backwards, like you're sort of.
Yeah, technically it is possible for something to go back. That is the idea, but ideally we want that they're going forward in the system.
Okay, and are these the figures that were in the systems paper?
I will have to check. I think this may have been in, if I had shown the modules.
I do see some biflows. Yeah, I pulled up the paper, and I do see there are biflows in the same way. Okay, I was just that was a little bit like, okay, well, as long as it's on purpose, you know, as long as they can go in both directions, then that's okay. Then slide 9, I noticed when you mentioned, I went back to my assignment when I did this assignment, so I was trying to like see, well, how can I give her some good feedback. I noticed you didn't mention that in migration when you were talking about some of these policies. Is that not an issue, or like are the dogs not coming in? Yeah.
You mean what's from like the stray dog paper from? Yeah. So we were talking. So we thought about that, but we're trying to keep it a closed system within, like, on a nationwide scale, or even if it's a city, we're just trying to keep it closed.
Okay.
There are various effects through that like Bangkok model. There is an immigration of dogs, but there also is an increased like birth rate, increased death rate. So those two have been, decreased death rate. We've considered those two, but we're trying to keep it as a closed system.
Okay. So you can just have, because you don't have subscripted dogs that came from outside the city or anything like that, just one population of dogs.
Yes, this is just one population of dogs. We have tried to split it, but it has become very, it became quite complex, to be very honest.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting. Like, I wanted to be honest, I wanted to explore further, but it is a lot to subdivide this population.
Yeah, I tried that. I got some data that was published about Bangkok dogs, and I was trying to make it work in the model, and I think that was a distraction. It didn't help me get closer to getting insight from the model.
Yeah, no, but
I have one more comment though. Let me see here.
Yeah.
Is there a link? Oh yeah. So I have a friend who, I don't know if this is her current job, but she used to be responsible for like stray dog policies in Romania at the national level. She was in the office that did that work. Could you share a link to the gaming environment so that I can share that with her?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Maybe in the chat, or is it in the paper? Yes.
So the thing is, we are still in the process of actually publishing the model, to be real, but it's not that much of a issue. It can also be, I can also send the model. That's not a problem, because the model is completely like existing within the paper. So it's there.
Yeah. So, but is there like a, an IC Systems website that
we are finalizing that? So that's good. If you're interested, I will definitely send that to you.
I'm very interested, because this is a family member, and it's always fun to sort of share with them some of the things that we do in our work. So
yeah, I've heard about the Romanian dog situation, so they would be very interested to see in different contexts how we can. And yeah, I'm very interested for people to use the interface.
All right.
For their local things.
Yeah. So let's talk about that over email then.
Absolutely. Yes.
Those are all my questions.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Martha?
I do have a question on the same slide. This is Rafat. I can see the scale of the simulation. The time goes to 100 years. 70 years. Is this the time horizon where you are looking for the effectiveness of the policy, or what determined the selection?
So to be honest, for the first two policies, I've shown sterilization and shelter on this scale because, well, there have been some studies that have shown that to be able to effectively reduce the population, there have been a lot of data, but it requires somewhere between 15 to 20 years of concerted effort. But this is meant to show that at this population that we're looking at, it doesn't complete it within that time. It would require much more than like even 50 years. But with social integration put into place, it looks very different because there's something coming back into the system. And that seems to be a very basic thought, but it's something that's really non-existent right now. There's only a huge outflow of funding for something that is repeatedly failing because of that goal-seeking behavior effect. So that's why that's on that scale, but this is on a much shorter scale. Does that make sense?
Thank you. If you go back to that slide, the one that you were just on, that has the 10 years.
Yes.
Yeah, it's if you're interested in feedback, the curves are very hard to read with so many different variables
Yes.
on top. So I think if you're building like a dashboard or something, this needs to be taken into consideration.
Yes, yes. No, that is
And
definitely.
unless there is a way to navigate those curves and be able to interpret them easily.
Yes, yeah. I think the only reason I've introduced like kept them all here is because, as I said, like when I'm putting one intervention in, it's in the model, it's passing through like 4 different modules. And so there are some important things in each module that are changing very drastically. So I've included them, but it is very true that it's quite overwhelming to see this many curves on one image.
Thank you.
Thank you. Martha.
Yeah, thank you, Urmila. This is a remarkable model and presentation. I'm a retired companion animal veterinarian, and I am an enthusiast in the modeling world and doing work with the society. 2 questions or leads or just ideas that I have are number one, as a veterinarian, I follow our Canadian Veterinary Medical Association updates around COVID. And I don't know if you're aware, but dogs are a reverse zoonotic receiver of COVID. There are seropositivities of that have been shown. I don't know about I don't know if this is misinformation, but in fact, there was a great controversy about a couple of dogs, I think in Britain, who supposedly developed myocarditis from COVID, and I think that paper was chucked out. But they're small players on the COVID web, zoonotic and reverse animal to human link and human to non-human animal link in the COVID web. And so I can, once I recover it, I can send you the link to this particular town hall update. Dr. Scott Weiss is his name. He's Canada Research Chair and is sort of responsible for our veterinary updates about the big picture as an animal shared disease. So dogs are in there, and the situation in North America is obviously going to be very different for the role that they play, I believe, in COVID sustaining itself, because the dogs in your situation, first of all, the human incidence of COVID is quite different from a lot of places, but maybe not that different actually from other countries in the world. But this, I don't know that anyone has studied the role that dogs play as a semi-feral population. And so just thinking of you looking for funding for this, the COVID angle may prove to be it's worth following up. You may get very important, funding. And also I think the raising of visibility that COVID really is not just a human problem. It's one of these one world health challenges. And this could be an example of just raising the visibility about, we're all in this together kind of as animals on the planet. So that's one. And I'll send you the Dr. Scott Weiss has a non-commercial blog website called wormsandgermsblog.ca. So I'll send that in the chat. The other angle is that you might want to pursue. I don't, and when you say that dogs in general are not high on the list of social status, shall we say, in India. There's a lot of research going on also now. It's also gaining greater visibility and a place in academia within the American Psychology Association. There's now a full department of people researching the nature of the human-animal bond or relationship. Everything from farmers and their and the animals they care for to the hunting dogs to the companion animal research, and you know, that's a whole other angle that perhaps could be explored. And this is a very unique example of it's a remarkable setting to be able to study just the nature of the human, and it's another dimension to investigate and raise visibility about the importance of studying the nature of the human, non-human animal bond. We're all animals, and it's a real problem I'm finding in the management of COVID, that important information is not getting out there to impact things such as vaccination rates, et cetera, et cetera. So I encourage you to follow up. I'll send you a link to a webinar that I also attended by the head of the department of the American Psychology Association, who is the representative for the human-animal bond relationship research.
That would be fantastic. This is all things that I think when I was doing like a literature review, I was looking through a lot of these, and there were just many different things that are involved. That's interesting that you said also, just, you know, in studying this context for my MQP, I did a lot of interviewing in India with people and how they perceive this idea, this policy, and as well as just the conventional policies. And it was very interesting. I think one of my biggest findings from that was that people of lowest socioeconomic status, like truly the lowest socioeconomic status, had the highest regard and bond with these dogs, and they were truly enriched by it so much. And and a lot of wealthier people are now realizing that they have this you know, this companionship that is there on, you know, there in some streets in India, there are 20 to 30 dogs, but people still import Great Danes and these species, and so it's a real thing. It's might be here in the US, but it's really not there yet. But yeah, no, that's very interesting.
No, it's recognized enough so much. I live in Canada. I'm coming from Canada here, and on the West Coast, well, here in Calgary as well. The homeless and people with mental health challenges, I mean, those two go together so much anyways. It's very recognized, seen as very valued to the well-being of these people, to the point where there are programs to the homeless people in Vancouver, for example. They are not just given places, they're not just given food themselves, they also get food for their companion dog who they live with. These dogs are their family, because it's recognized that the vulnerable populations have incredible value in these types of relationships.
There's also a really big psychiatric like help deficit in India, so it's a huge deal. There's been studies
I see what you're saying. No, the companion animal in the psychiatric population, you can't even begin. I mean, that is so many studies. But
Yeah.
well, no, kudos to you. This is a very, 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 I think, important and under publicized element that penetrates into so many other areas, including COVID. We're just not getting the full story, and I don't get it. And so this is great for raising
Yeah, no, it's
visibility.
very interesting. I didn't think about the COVID aspect, so I will definitely look into that.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, people are really starting to study these dogs now in India,
Yeah.
more for conservation, because they are truly just entering national parks. They are
Yeah.
pretty good hunters in packs, and they take down leopards and very endangered species. So
well, you know, that's very interesting, because that just makes them more I think more considered to be studied, because if they're doing that, the whole feline population, the zoo, the tigers, the lions, the cougar, all these guys, the felines are much more vulnerable. There's much more COVID-19 seropositivity in the feline population, which interacts, which is in touch with the human. So if those dogs,
Yep.
I mean, you could do an entire epidemiologic sub-study, entire on this topic alone, because we don't know in North America, the dogs who have been affected by COVID are, you know, they're companion dogs, they're their own dogs, their range, their contact with other dogs, their blah, 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 with other humans is pretty well charted out. But
yeah,
you do not know in a feral population, which is entirely enmeshed with human population, we don't know what role stray cats and stray dogs
right.
would be playing. Probably the cats are higher, but they may be closing some loops of infectivity and the spread and sustaining of the spread of COVID in India because of your. I'm just curious, what is the feral cat situation like? I'm being a road hog here. I'm sorry.
No, there's definitely a very high stray cat population. I wouldn't know how it compares exactly, but from my experience, I feel like it's not as big as a problem as with dogs. I know
Well,
in the
that's
US, there's been
fortunate.
a lot of, yeah, in the US, there's been a lot of stray cat outbreaks, sort of, but this is still what's most also interesting for me. Like, I have lived in India a few years here and there, and it's a huge emotional bond that people create with dogs in India. Like, they're a very unique type of land race. They're not like the what you really expect of a stray feral rabies infected dog. They're actually very emotionally capable, but also very, very strong. So they're able to hunt, fend, and also connect with. So it's a very interesting context.
Well, you could consider. There's nothing wrong with reaching out in life. You could also consider contacting your national veterinary medical association and telling them about your study. From an epidemiologic point of view, you know what, the global studies around this as a shared condition they need to be done. And your IVMA, I don't know, India Veterinary Medical Association, they would, if you're looking for funding, you know what, they're out there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would push the COVID angle, and you may get a lot more fun. You might get nothing, you might get a lot. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just ideas.
Thank you so much. That was very helpful.
Thank you. Al?
Thanks. I'm also in Canada. I'm surprised Martha didn't mention one FRD control mechanism that we have here. It's called winter. But on a more serious note, in our province,
yeah,
Saskatchewan, next door to Alberta, we took a look at using peace officers. So they're not police, they're not army, but they are with their peace officer status. They can carry guns and they can control animals. These are they're livestock inspectors. Actually, they check for cattle brands to stop cattle rustling and stuff like that. But they have peace officer status, and so we're looking at them as animal control officers. So in terms of the delays in your study, I was wondering about euthanizers and sterilizers, like the population of people that do that. If that population increased, would it reduce the time or have an impact on time delays?
That's a very good point. Yeah, support system in terms of, I mean, I think not only even then, but just many other things that don't still exist. Veterinary support for these sort of things. But no, that's definitely bad. That's kind of falls into the category of things where I was saying that there are many things that will improve with the model if like through the course of carrying this out, but it's not something I envision that like we can start with a very high number of people. It will just like, it needs to be, it's kind of like something I feel that needs to be publicized and put into place in order for it to improve. But that is very true that it will be much, much more successful if, yeah, first of all, if there are more veterinarians, there are more trainers. Usually trainers just work with breed animals, which is probably easier in some way because you know what they're going to do. And yeah, definitely euthanizer and sterilizer. Right now, they're kind of usually people who are very much like less paid. It's a very semi-voluntary work to carry it out, which is why it does not last for 20 years or anything. It's usually very local. I mean, if you see a dog on the street with a ticked off, like a bit of his ear cut off, then you know that street has been sterilized. But there's no way to find out if, I mean, majority of the time you don't see that. So it's not very consistent. So that's.
Thanks, good job.
No, thank you.
I had a question, Urmila. In the original Bangkok model, migration was a huge deal because of the carrying capacity. And if I look at one of your slides, not the one we just saw, I don't know what that carrying.
Sorry, should have not stopped.
That's fine on that slide, but on the previous slide, the carrying capacity is always the same. If we go back, carrying capacity. Okay, I don't know what carrying capacity survival effect means. Maybe you could just explain that to me.
Okay, so I think maybe if I can go back a little bit to the actual module that includes that would be more helpful. So in that, what was happening with sterilization was it's basically removing population from the initial population. And at the same time, that's causing a decreased birth fraction as well as a like increased death rate. So the death rate is also decreasing as well. So there is kind of a management through there. I'm not really sure what you mean in terms of the
Well, I don't know how familiar you are with the original Bangkok issue, but the original issue there is that the carrying capacity doesn't change. And because the carrying capacity doesn't change, dogs are coming into the area and replacing those that have been removed.
Right.
Available.
Mm-hmm. So in this case, as we were mentioning before, that we're not looking for, we're not doing a waste management thing. So it's also not, we're not increasing, like there's no pores in the borders of the system. So we're trying to keep it a very closed system. That is definitely something that can be improved in the system, but it's, we're not sure how much to bring it in terms of like how much immigration should we allow into the system. So
I understand that, but if you're, and I understand that's what Professor Saeed set up the border for with you, and that's fine, but I want to raise the question because it's not a closed world. And if the carrying capacity stays high, your numbers that you're showing here, you show that in some scenarios, the population of the free range dogs drops off. That won't be the case if there's food available for them to come in and eat.
Right. No, that's very valid. I think something that I've been thinking about that continuously, that there is, there are definitely shortcomings in the system, but what we were trying to see, and what we're still trying to improve in the model is how can we, So right now I showed like the model, you can put in one policy at a time. You can also put in multiple policies at a time in different areas in different ways. And that can try to sort of reduce the effects of these carrying capacity problems, but it's still very unclear to us how we're going to really bring that out. Because I know there is immigration in, but it's very difficult to manage with all the other things that are going on. But do you have any advice? Like, do you think it should be included in the same way it was included in the Bangkok model?
Well, I don't think I believe the results if it's not included. If carrying capacity isn't dealt with.
Yeah. But that's it's a valid thought. I think that's something definitely that can be considered. I'm trying to also remember if there's any other aspect that may have been put into place instead of that. I'll keep that in my mind. I'll see if there's maybe I can address that.
Thank you.
Jack?
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And the model is modeling the Indian dog population as a whole, right?
Yes. Well, the thing is, it can be for any context though. So it could be at a city level, or it could be at like a county level or something like that. So there's no like, it's not like it has to be country level necessarily.
Because I would think the larger area you're looking at, the less important immigration becomes. Because
Yeah.
certainly dogs can come from outside a city into a city, but it's a lot smaller percentage will come from outside.
Yes. Yeah, to kind of refer to that, if I can just say a word on that, I think when we were setting up the model, I know Professor Said has looked at Bangkok, which was a really ideal like immigration and sterilization study, but any study that's been in India has been kind of ultra local, and it's shown that it's not very, it wasn't very considerate. They weren't very considerate of things kind of in other places. But if it's kind of scaled to more of a national level, you can kind of prioritize zones, but also like model it for the whole population, the full population. I don't know if that's very clear, but that's just something I wanted to say. You can continue if you want to say.
Yeah, I was just going to ask a different question. Could you go into a bit more detail? Why is sterilization so effective when it follows the social integration policy, whereas it wasn't effective or it took 50 years on its own? Is it because the budget is larger, or is it because so many dogs have been adopted as part of the social integration policy?
In this case, it's only because of the increased budget. For social integration, though, something like there's some things that I didn't get to mention, but for social integration, we've also put into place some sterilization, but it's very minimal and it's going in the background. But there are a lot of things that are linked. This is why a lot of like the human awareness things I want to include, because I think that in reality, after 5-6 years of social integration, the mindset overall would change. So sterilization will be more doable and more realistic, and carrying it out, being able to tell the government, or like a small scale local government, that you need to do it for 5 to 10 years steadily is much more doable than telling them to keep doing it onwards, and there's no outlook on how many years it's going to take. So it can be done on a shorter time scale with more approval in the community and understanding and more funding.
Okay, thank you.
Is there anything else?
So I have, well, just because we were on the slide and I was thinking about what Kareem said. And sorry, I don't recall if you said there were anything about any policies regarding trash and increase in trash disposal, or trying to decrease the trash that's the food for the dogs? For example, here where I live, I'm surprised that they pick up twice a week versus back in Massachusetts, they only pick up once a week.
Yeah, I had said that for India, it'd be, I mean, it's understood that it would be pretty bad animal welfare wise to reduce and completely eradicate food poverty. It would be a very effective pest reduction strategy, but to be honest, the reality is so different on the ground there with just many dogs that you cannot do that. You can't just cut off complete food supply. Waste management on its own is great, but there's also people who are feeding them. That's actually the main thing. They're not just eating trash and surviving. There are people who are helping them survive for years, 10 years or whatever that is. So that isn't a very, that's a very pest-based approach, I think, but it's not very considerate in some ways, I think.
So there should be another index of social acceptability of policies.
Yeah, that's something that I was trying to understand through my interviews, was how accepting people are of the different policies. Yeah. In fact, I am like, the reason for getting into this policy was because a lot of people mostly everyone who I've interviewed was very against the just purely removal based strategies. And they were really interested in how can we keep these dogs, but in better care. Again, it was a little associated with like socioeconomic status, but they realized the true kind of value of having some sort of animals. And in Indian cities, there's very little access to wildlife, to wild areas. So it has a huge mental impact as well on the people. So, sorry, Martha, did you want?
Yeah, just going to say, I mean, that comment, that phenomenon alone would be a very interesting topic to share on the intricacies of the dynamic, like a dynamic view of the human-animal bond relationship, and how that itself would be shifting through your study. The shifting from the pest control strategy and social acceptability, social acceptance of that, to a peaceful coexistence and a mutual from that stage to a mutual benefit status of relationship. I mean, that itself is a brilliant topic alone for a study in the nature of the dynamic nature and how it's evolving of the human animal, the human non-human animal relationship.
Yeah,
there's so many ways this study could go. It's remarkable.
Yeah, hopefully it can be carried out in reality. I think a thought that I also wanted to bring up, again, responding to Karim's previous comment, is that there have been a lot of things that I was thinking about more from like a biological conservation research standpoint on how to manage for. So I think someone mentioned before that there's one population, which is in a way incorrect, because there's a rural, much more feral population and then compared to a much more human bond oriented, like much more urban population of FRD. It's very difficult there's very little known on their differences in their characteristics and all that. So it's very hard to actively model that difference. But a lot of the entry into cities is coming in from those rural village areas. And I feel like overall, you can't apply the same policy across the board. You need to probably things like less service therapy oriented things. Those dogs will not come from more village, like rural areas. Those will be more urban centric animals. So there needs to be a cutoff on how you're assessing that. So the boundary might be more, you might be more aware of what the exact boundary is, and therefore immigration can be sort of like accounted for in that way. But that's something also I've been thinking about. How do you split the population according to what they're really like? But that needs to be studied, I think, further. Awesome.
Jack,
Anyone?
last question.
Yeah, just thinking what you were mentioning about how valuable this bond with the dogs is for a certain population, especially in urban areas, it sounds like. And is it unrealistic to expect a lot of these people to be able to have their own dog, so to speak, that is not free ranging? Because I don't know much about India, but I would think there are certain situations where you can't have a pet dog. It's not realistic. And if so, is there?
Yeah,
is
no,
that something?
Yes, definitely in many cases, in a lot of, very tightly knit communities, slum areas, it would definitely not be that easy to keep an animal within doors all the time. So things that I've spoken to, service animal people with is that starting off a little bit more on the other end is usually very helpful to get the ball rolling. So maybe not immediately looking at those who are kind of at the socioeconomically lowest point, but understanding what is their interest and trying to create that bond for people who can afford. And there are many of those people who can afford and can keep local dogs, like many people, and trying to create that understanding with them that this is a true value. That's I think more on the ground, creating that effect. But it's true that capacity, space, those sort of things needs to be considered. Also funding, because it is expensive to keep an animal in the home. But there are a lot of other things. There's a lot of ideas that have popped up, like not necessarily are we just saying pets here. It could be also a way to create a system of dogs that are more like, they offer relief for some people, but they can be housed in different places. Like it can be more like a centralized thing. But these are all ideas that have come up with people, but very valid that not everyone can keep an animal.
Right, and in that case, is there value in having a free-ranging population to some degree, to the extent where it might not be your goal to bring it down to zero? That's just a thought.
Very true. That was one of my questions. That was my last question always on every interview to people is, do you want dogs to be taken off the streets? How do you feel about that? I got very mixed responses to that. Some people said no. And then I said, why? And then they said, well, then they'd be killed. And then their first reaction was usually that something bad, which apparently worse, is going to be happening to them if they're off the streets. Because in some communities, they are well taken care of. So when they said, what about the alternative where they're taken care of off the streets, but just not on the streets? They were much more, anybody who really cared was much more interested in that. They did say that, yes, if a dog is taken off the street and is taken care of, I'd rather it be there than on the street. So there was some realistic sense in how people were responding. It wasn't just that I want them to be suffering on the street, but then there were other people who said that 9 people in my family have been bitten by dogs. I am petrified of them. My children hate animals. I can't step outside with the dogs. And yes, I would love them to be gone. So I saw this nice balance of people, which is very helpful for this sort of a policy. But yeah, that's what I can say to that.
Okay. Thank you, Urmila, for presenting, and thank you everybody for attending. And I'm stopping there.